All right, thank you very much. So we have some time, so I can expand in an extra hour or something. No, I'm kidding. So I'm going to be focusing today on our floating wetlands project, essentially. We do a lot of other stuff. Actually, a big chunk of the work we do is stormwater retention. So everything that we've been talking about and discussing is very near and dear to me as well, because we do a lot of stormwater management, a lot of constructed wetlands, water retention projects that we monitor and study and model and try to figure out. So that's a whole nother area that we could talk about. So I'm just going to be sharing with you a little bit of a more unique approach, I think. It's been really refreshing talking to other folks. I found out Saskatoon also has floating wetlands. We know there's floating wetlands being implemented in Alberta. We know there's other projects planned for Saskatchewan and in Manitoba. So it's kind of new for us too. So in Manitoba, we're kind of in the pilot stage still, so we're not really that advanced as well. And so answering questions together, we can try to figure these things out. But they're really cool systems, and I became really fascinated with these things a long time ago. Early on in my research career, I always trying to figure out how can we integrate these weird things into the work that we do. And so we kind of got an opportunity to do some research and expanded into some of this pilot work, connected with some of the other folks around the world that use them, and it's been really, really, really fun. So I'm going to first talk about natural infrastructure. I don't take a step back and look at the history of where we got to where we are. Why on earth would we be fooling around with these floating wetlands? Why are we doing the work that we do with water retention? And it's a lot of the similar things that we've been talking about, but one of the things that hasn't come up a lot is the phosphorus issue. So we've been talking a lot about flooding and drought and carbon, but the phosphorus issue that's really been a driver for us in Manitoba and within the Lake Winnipeg watershed itself, which is, of course, crosses across Saskatchewan into Alberta, down into the United States. So we sort of got involved early on in this discussion. Around 2010 is when we kind of joined the party. From about 2004, though, there was a lot of reports coming out, a lot of state of play reports on what's happening in the Lake Winnipeg watershed. And we realized we have issues with phosphorus in the watershed. And this stuff is coming from everywhere. It's coming from wastewater treatment plants, it's coming from agriculture, it's coming from industry. And this phosphorus then ending up in our waterways. And too much phosphorus creates problems with too much algae and other things. Phosphorus, like nitrogen, is a fertilizer. It's a food for plants. We thrive on phosphorus and nitrogen fertilizer. The plants thrive on this stuff, and so you add a little bit of this stuff into the water, and things like algae grow like crazy. And so that's where kind of the issues are happening. We realize there's issues on lakes like Lake Winnipeg. That's how we kind of got involved into it. And our priority was trying to look at ways of reducing this phosphorus from coming off the landscape and getting into the waterways, ending up in lakes and streams like Lake Winnipeg, like other lakes across our watersheds. So it was really the phosphorus that was a driver for us, and that brought us to working with natural infrastructure and eventually to the wetlands. So we've talked a lot about these biological systems. I always love hearing about what other people are doing. The rain garden stuff is, really cool. The stuff that Vancouver is doing is amazing. So really need to learn more about what other cities and communities are doing. And it all comes down to a lot of the work that we do is, very similar to what we've been hearing is about the power of these things like wetlands. We know that they're extremely effective filters. They filter nutrients and contaminants off the landscape. They hold a lot of water, and just like we've been hearing, we've lost a lot of our wetlands too. They say about 70% of our wetlands in Manitoba have been lost. So that function on the landscape, we've lost it. And so a lot of the work that we do is restoring and rehabilitating these wetland systems as these natural filters and sponges on the landscape that we can utilize. So we're not engineering and creating completely artificial systems. What we're doing is just rehabilitating and working with these systems, creating water control structures to hold back water. These wetland systems are created, and they create that biological activity. And so Now we come to the floating wetlands part of it. How do these fit into the picture? Well, a lot of the systems that we were working in, older systems such as the old stormwater pond systems, they weren't really designed for growing vegetation. You know, they weren't created as a wetland. They were created as a giant basin. And so it's quite difficult without a lot of engineering to have those systems be able to grow plants. And so these things, these floating platforms, you can introduce them into these older stormwater ponds, these systems that weren't designed for growing a lot of vegetation, and create those shallower areas, create those platforms for the vegetation to grow. And these aquatic plants are exceptionally well at growing in these kind of conditions. It's almost like a hydroponic system. You know, you're creating that floating system. The roots grow down into the water column. And it's not just the plants that are doing stuff. It's all the other things that are growing in these ecosystems. So it's all the bacteria, the algae, all that biofilm, that slimy stuff that grows on the roots and on the surface. You get invertebrates, you get small fish, you get larger fish. And so you help restore that ecosystem, and all those things are functioning together to create that biological activity, to reduce nutrients and contaminants, to improve oxygen conditions into these systems, creating the more higher oxygen conditions can also reduce methane emissions. So you're getting a lot of benefits by introducing these biological things into our waterways. So I'm going to be talking to you about bioremediation. It's just a fancy word of cleaning things up. And it's weird. We've done a lot of research level stuff, and we've been doing a lot of applied implementation work as well. And so mainly we've been working in these stormwater pond systems, you know, and trying to enhance the habitat, enhance the biodiversity of these systems. We've done a little bit of wastewater work as well, which I'll show you. And then we do a lot of these are livestock watering tubs, these giant swimming pool things. So we do a lot of research scale stuff as well to try to understand the fine dynamics of what was actually happening. Because it's much more difficult to monitor and measure things in an open system compared to having an isolated system where you can add things and look at things. So with wastewater lagoons, these things are all over the place. And these are more the rural, the smaller lagoon systems. I'm not talking about the giant wastewater treatment facilities or city or town-sized. These are smaller community, rural wastewater lagoons. There's hundreds of them across Manitoba. A lot of them function quite well, but a lot of them also don't function all that well. They're older systems. Some of them are aging and in need of better maintenance. The smaller systems are not regulated for things like phosphorus discharge. They're regulated for the other nasty stuff, but once those things get down to a certain level, they can just drain the lagoon system, and they're not monitoring for phosphorus and other things necessarily. So there's lots of these systems out there, and a lot of these systems were designed as, you know, a couple cells. You have your primary lagoon, which is more, you know, that takes the raw sewage. You have your secondary cells. And then often that's it, and they release into the system after that. You can gain a lot of benefit if you include a wetland tertiary lagoon, what they call them, essentially a third cell, or maybe even your secondary cell just naturally grows into a wetland. We've seen lots of those as well. The one that we're working in, the secondary lagoon is essentially half a wetland. And so these systems which have more plants in them, more biological activity, they can help treat that system. And there's lots of research out there that shows by adding this wetland, this third cell or this wetland polishing cell, it can really drive down the nutrients and contaminants and things before it's released into the system. So this is not a lot of the work that we do, but a lot of our partners do this that we work with. They're working with the municipalities to try to create this extra treatment into these systems. But these things take up a lot of room. They're expensive. Obviously, a lot of communities don't have room for another cell. And so that's where these floating wetland systems could be useful. So this was our very first pilot scale research level system. We can call it the first of its kind in Manitoba because it literally was. And it was really rewarding because the wastewater has plenty of nutrients in it, so we didn't have to worry about the plants not growing and not surviving, because once we planted them, this was literally the next spring, and this is the same year. This is later in the fall after we planted, and you can see the plants, they just exploded. You know, when we first planted them, I'll show you another picture. But we were trying to prove that these systems could function in Manitoba. We didn't invent these things. These things for many years have been used globally. There's lots of research on these things being used for wastewater treatment, for other contaminant treatment, nutrients. So we wanted to showcase them in Manitoba, that we could use them here as well. How do they function in our climate? Essentially was the biggest question. Was, okay, well, we have winters. How do these things survive? How often do you have to maintain them? Do you have to replant them? All these questions that groups would have is the questions that we were trying to answer. We wanted to have them here so people could see them and touch them, you know, and see what they do. How they show up is on a pallet. So this is a specific product from the States. These are biohaven floating islands. They work quite well. They're these giant floating scrub brushes, basically, and they have planting holes that are put in them. So they show up. We had a bunch of volunteers from the local watershed district, and the plants that we get, they're all local plants. So we're not growing things in greenhouses. We're not importing anything exotic. They're all local plants. They're from the ditches just around the area. So these are the species that exist there. We're not importing invasive species, that type of thing. So we have a bunch of volunteers. We dug out a bunch of plant plugs, stick them in there, and they looked absolutely terrible when we first deployed them. So they look extremely sad. The plants, you know, a lot of them look like they're dying off right away. But they need that settling time. And so after about a month, they spend quite a bit of time just trying to get established. When you lift them up, you can see lots of roots growing down into the water column. That's where they're spending a lot of their energy. And then all of a sudden, they start shooting up the emergent part. And then as part of this project, too, what I really want to mention is we looked at duckweed. So this wasn't a passion of ours. This was a passion of our colleagues that were working with us. The gentleman scooping there he works for a landscape consulting company. So they're really interested in the duckweed part of it. Duckweed is this little tiny floating plant. It looks like algae. A lot of people think it's algae growing on the water surface, but it's a little tiny plant. And it grows like crazy. So within the first year, we had 3 harvests of this stuff. So we'd start out with a little bit. The first sort of addition was a coffee cup full of it that we scooped out of the ditch. And within a couple weeks, our whole little corral system was full. And we harvested 3 times that first summer. So you can imagine the amount of phosphorus and other stuff that's collected in those plants. And to look at it even further, we were looking at with one of our municipalities this aquatic plant harvester that they were using. So the city of Winnipeg, that's the city of Winnipeg's harvester. The municipality that we were working with borrowed it to clean out some of their stormwater ponds. And it's absolutely remarkable the tons of duckweed biomass and the amount of phosphorus that was taken out of that system just by harvesting this duckweed. It was about a dozen dump truck loads full of duckweed that they were hauling out of that system. And it went to the compost area, so all that vegetation was composted. So really cool. Like it's a really neat thing, but we're not pursuing this, but I just want to really mention it. If anyone's interested in harvesting duckweed, it's really, really quite interesting. So stormwater treatment, I just want to show you some examples of some of the projects that we put in working with the rural municipalities. As I mentioned before, the sort of the conventional old-style stormwater pond, they're not designed for growing vegetation. So they're often rock-lined. They have they don't have good slopes into the water. They are excellent habitat for geese. And people who live around these community stormwater ponds learn to really absolutely hate geese because, of course, they're pooping all over the place and digging up their grass. So they're absolutely horrible for attracting geese, these old systems. Whereas the more naturalized wetland type systems, the geese don't like them as much. You don't have them congregating the systems. The water quality is much better. The air quality is much better. You don't get the stench, the smells coming off the more wetland systems. So City of Winnipeg, their regulations now require new developments to have these naturalized wetland stormwater ponds. So they're moving away from the conventional rock-lined ponds to now these wetland type systems, which is really much more beneficial. And so we work a little bit in the wetland type systems, but really where these floating wetlands are useful is in the wastewater lagoon systems, but also in these older type of stormwater ponds. So in 2021, we installed our first stormwater pond systems, quite big systems. We're sort of moving beyond the small scale. Over on the left side, that stormwater pond is slightly smaller. It's a little more naturalized. It's an older system in that community. So there's quite a number of ponds in that specific community which look like that. So the ratio of the number of wetlands within that small pond was really good, because if you have the ponds which are too big, so the one on the right, that stormwater pond is quite massive. So we have just a couple. The islands are quite large, but they look dwarfed in this giant pond. So we were comparing essentially two systems. We have the older style, little more naturalized stormwater ponds, and then we have the brand new ones. That one's only a couple of years old. Again, they built it in the conventional style, rock-lined, very sharp slopes, and so that's not going to create very good natural vegetation habitat. So we introduced these floating islands into those systems. So those were our first ones in 2021. Last year we have another system, a different system. I'll show you that one in a different slide. And then next year we have a number of systems going in as well. So another RM is we're working with this coming in the springtime. Very basic, easy, requires a little bit of labor. Again, we have volunteers that come out and help us. Students that we're working with, they love to come out and help as well. So same thing, we collected plants from the ditches close by, transplanted them into the islands. They look terrible right away. We get some complaints about what the heck are you guys putting into the pond. But then after a few weeks, they start greening up. They look quite nice. And by the fall time, they actually look quite well. So this was that pond that I showed you, the little picture. I blew it up so it's a little bigger. This is 2021. So that's us planting. They look pretty good right now, but then come back in a few days, all those plants fell over because they're not too happy. So that's 2021. And then in 2022, just 1 year after planting, I don't know how easy that is to see, they were completely overgrown. You couldn't even tell that they were artificial. It looks like a natural floating island. These floating islands, they create themselves in nature. Things break off in wetlands. So they look actually really quite natural. So what we're looking at now is how much maintenance is required. So the wastewater treatment ones, we've now cleaned them off 2 times, I think now, because they grow quite rapidly. They create a lot of material, and the next year all that stuff is dead, and then the new plants have to try to grow through it. So you do have to maintain them, get rid of that debris every few years. So now that's what we're seeing now with this site, is how often does it require maintenance. And we learned also, we knew this too, it was a dumb mistake. We knew that geese were going to be a problem, but we wanted to kind of see, how necessary fencing these islands would be. The smaller pond, actually, so the figure that I just showed you, we didn't have to fence those at all, because the geese did not like the smaller, more naturalized pond. So we didn't have any issues. There were ducks in there, and the ducks absolutely loved to loaf on the islands. But in the bigger pond, this was literally overnight. So the islands looked quite nice. Then the geese showed up in the fall time, and literally overnight they completely destroyed the islands. So these would have looked actually quite nice towards the fall, later summer, and then the geese completely destroyed the islands. So we put a fence around them, learned our lesson, and we figured, okay, in a system like this, you definitely have to protect them. So now the new ones are all going to have fencing. This fencing will probably come off this year. We probably could have taken them off last year. Once the plants are established, you don't need the fencing anymore. And it's absolutely incredible. So some of our research stuff that we've done is looking at what's happening under the water. And this is a couple months of growth, that's it. You know, those roots, they grow like crazy into the water column. We're finding all kinds of invertebrates, little critters that are growing, you know, in the water systems underneath the roots, on the roots. So it's actually really remarkable, the ecosystem that you're creating. And some of the numbers here, this is hard to see. This is not our system. This is a group out of New Zealand that are doing this same type of thing. New Zealand and Australia, these islands are quite popular, so there's quite a bit of research that's come out from there. And they're showing about 50 to 80% removal of different things. So suspended solids, phosphorus, nitrogen is what they're studying. And they're showing upwards, you know, 50% removal of phosphorus type thing in some of these systems. So that's quite good. So we're not at the stage yet where we're able to monitor the open lagoon system. So we're trying to figure out what they're doing from a research scale. And there's some really cool designs, again, that the groups are doing down there. That they're creating on the sides there, they have these flow-through systems. So that's, again, a challenge that we're working with, too, is where to put the islands. So we don't have enough islands to cover the whole pond, and you probably don't want to do that. But how others have set them up is sort of like filter systems. Set them up in front of culverts, so outlet culverts act as a filter moving out of the system. They create these sort of flow-through systems on the sides, so they're having that water moves through there. And it essentially works, you know, it's kind of like an aquarium filter, moving the dirty water in and the clean water comes out on the other side. So there's a lot of innovation out there that how these systems are being used as well. And then you can add some engineering to it. You can have these curtains that help slow the flow, you know, help sedimentation, things like that. So things that we're not doing currently, but it's these interesting things that we're definitely taking note of and learning from what other people are doing. And so just to touch on some of the research scale stuff we've done and some of the outreach that we've done. So we've also produced some communications products, things that we can hand to people. You know, you can find these on our website, just to try to understand these things a little more. So when we talk about these things, people can get a better understanding of what these things actually do, how to build them. We have these fun little videos on how to build your own floating wetland. So a lot of the research that we've done is at the experimental lakes area. So IISD, the company that I work for, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, we also own and operate the experimental lakes area. So it's a research facility in northwestern Ontario. It was formerly run by the federal government. We took it over in 2014, and we've had a lot of growth in the type of research that we're able to do out there. And one of the things that we've done is some of the floating wetlands stuff. So some of the earlier research that we did is essentially trying to figure out how much phosphorus impacts these things. And it's quite a tiny amount of phosphorus, actually, when you look at these things. You don't have to look at high doses. It's actually quite surprising. So we looked at sort of one of our lakes is a more nutrient poor. One of the lakes is an experimental lake. It's had phosphorus added to it artificially for many decades. And the difference is remarkable. So in that lake, which has been having phosphorus added to it, is not even close to the kind of phosphorus levels you get in our systems across the prairies. So the phosphorus loading is actually quite low. But that little bit of phosphorus really makes the plants respond. So it's a little bit extra food, a little bit extra fertilizer, and the plants really take off. And we were studying how much root mass. That's like 2 months of growth, that bundle of roots. It's really remarkable. And again, some more communications products. So there with the fundraising that the Experimental Lakes area does, we've produced some brochures and things. But one of the really interesting sides of the research has been looking at the contaminants. So we've, as well as the nutrients, they were also, some of our students were interested in looking at more, the oil products and antibiotics, things like that. We have research going on. So this project actually just ended. It was a 5-year study looking at the impacts of oil spills, looking at how we can use natural things such as microorganisms. Actually, Paul brought this up, that in the environment, I think it was Paul, that there's microorganisms in the environment that will break down everything. So, and that's exactly what we were looking at too, is these natural microorganisms in these systems, these oil-eating microorganisms, can we enhance their growth? And so the floating islands provide the surface area. It creates the habitat for these microorganisms to grow. And the research showed that, yes, indeed, we do have increased levels of oil-eating bacteria that grow in these things. And things like floating wetlands or other biological things could be used to help reduce oil impacts. And then we also looked at some smaller scale stuff. So we had some in-lake stuff. We had some smaller scale tub experiments. So again, adding oil, what levels of oil can be cleaned up, remediated. What types of plants. So the student was looking at different kinds of plants, comparing them and what they do. And then the antibiotics. So this is the same lagoon that I showed you before, the wastewater lagoon. So I have a PhD student. He's been looking at nutrient removal, but also antibiotics, the developments of antibiotic-resistant genes. So again, showing that these biological systems are very good at cleaning stuff up, at treating things, and showing that plants and microorganisms together either take up antibiotics or break down antibiotics, things like that. So again, very interesting stuff. He's done some in-lagoon stuff, some in-tank stuff. So again, very interesting. So not only do the floating wetlands have a benefit for nutrients and other things, but they also have benefits for contaminants like oil or treating antibiotics, things like that. And then we've been doing some wild rice work. So most of our work is focused on things like cattails, sedges, those your classic wetland plants you see everywhere across the prairies. But then now we're part of this wild rice project, so seeing if you can grow wild rice on these floating islands. And our answer so far is no, you can't. So the wild rice apparently needs a submerged stage, but we're going to try it again next spring. Some of our colleagues are convinced, no, we can do this. We can grow them on floating islands. So we'll try it again, but we'll see. The first year showed us we can't. So these are some of the other systems that we're also using. So we're not only promoting one system. The biohavens is the ones that we've been using. Actually, in the lagoon system, that was a different system, the bee mats. They look like those foam exercise mats. It's another system, and they have hydroponic pots basically, and that's how those grow. This is a phytolinks system, comes out of southern Ontario. Modular, so that you can make them as big and different shapes that you want. We have a bunch of these in storage that we are going to deploy this next spring probably. So again, it's kind of like a floating bread tray. So if in the grocery store, the bread comes on a tray. The ones that I showed you before are research scale ones, those yellow rings. Those were just basically floating bread trays. We jury-rigged them in there, our DIY, basically floating island. This is a more sophisticated version of a floating bread tray. It's like a frame that grows the plants. And these are another one that we're going to be using probably in a new city project and in some of the work we're doing in East Africa. These are the biomatrix, and they're mostly floating coconut fiber, so that coconut coir material. And they're held together. There are these long tubes of coconut material, and they're held together by plastic fencing. So you can't get away from the plastic part of it for this system, but they're about 60 to 70% organic material compared to some of the artificial material. So these are the ones that are interested for some of these other studies. Chicago actually has a big revegetation in the Chicago River. This is kind of where the inspiration comes from one of the city projects. It has these islands along the river shorelines and things, so really quite interesting. So we haven't used them yet, but this is another system that's out there that we're going to look at. And that's it for me.